yeah, protein utilization ratios, and yeah. So there's, and I think for the listener that may not be familiar with that, there are just some different rating scales that scientists have developed that allow researchers and clinicians and various people to compare different sources of protein in kind of a head-to-head fashion to, highlight which sources might be considered to, be a higher quality or lower quality. And then when we do that, the animal proteins tend to fare really pretty well. So that I think kind of led the way in terms of, well, which sources should we consume? And then I think that then we also started getting this proliferation of literature, right, from Bob Wolf's group, and yeah, from those, he's in Little Rock now, and they have absolutely transformed what we know about protein, exercise, and amino acids, and they really kind of made it clear that the concentration of essential amino acids in the blood is a primary driver, is a primary signal to the skeletal tissue on kind of promote increases in muscle protein synthesis, greater improvements overall in muscle protein turnover.
I want to thank one of the sponsors for the show, and that is BetterHelp, HELP. And listen, there are times when life throws you curveballs. Those are never fun. And the more professional help, I believe the better your chances of getting out of it quicker. BetterHelp Online Therapy will assess your needs and can match you with your own licensed professional therapist in less than 48 hours. And listen, I have used a therapist for many years. And in fact, I recommend for nearly all my patients to go through that process, not just in terms of the times of turmoil, but in general, because it is a domain that needs to be assessed and addressed. Listen, this is not a crisis line. It's not self-help. This is professional therapy done securely online, available to people worldwide. And I think that this is a great service. It is even more affordable than traditional offline therapies, and financial aid is available. They have a special offer for my listeners. You can get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/Dr. Lyon. That's 10% off your first month of online therapy at betterhelp.com/Dr. Lyon. Welcome, Dr. Chad Kerksick. I am so excited to have you. Not only are you a dear friend, but you are the incoming president of the International Society for Sports Nutrition. You are a professor of exercise science at Lindenwood in Missouri, which is where we actually met. You are no slouch in publications, having published over 100 papers, many of which are going to be incredibly interesting to my audience, which we will link a handful because you and I are going to talk about that. What I love about you, aside from being much taller than me, is that you cast a wide net on your interests, everything from protein to ergogenic aids, and something that is very unique and I've noticed that you've really paid attention to, as well as, is that you've also focused on the female athlete.
Yeah.
And that is a very underserved population in terms of the literature. So I am hoping that as we go through and we talk about some of your clinical interests, that we'll be able to tie in some of the gender differences in terms of, if any, as it relates to carbohydrate consumption, as it relates to ergogenic aids. I'm really fascinated. You have a clinical interest in, and I quote, examining the impact of exercise and nutritional interventions on changes in health, performance, and recovery of active and clinical populations.
Yep, that's what we do.
Welcome. Did I miss anything?
No, you did a great job.
In this episode, I want to really cover two things. You have, again, published multiple papers, and as the incoming president of the International Society of Sports Nutrition, you are the first author on the position stand on nutrient timing. So we're going to cover nutrient timing, and I want to cover ergogenic aids. And that's probably all we're going to have time for. We're going to do a deep dive on both of those. And actually, one more thing. You also recently published a review on plants, on plant-based, the proteins and exercise. What role can plant proteins have in promoting adaptations to exercise? And this was in Nutrients recently in 2021. What do you think? Rock and roll?
That's great. Yeah, your team has done their homework.
Yes, sir. Well, I want to provide a lot of value to the audience. And also, one of the ideas of this podcast is to bring people on that deserve a platform and that are actually very influential in this space, that perhaps are in the trenches and doing the work and not necessarily on social media. Because let's face it, we've seen your social media page. By we, I mean me.
if there's a part, yeah.
Abysmal.
That part of my existence is fairly abysmal. So I definitely need to talk about that.
Well, that is why I wanted to provide a platform for you, because again, you are a fine scientist, and I would love for you to share, before we dive in to this specific paper, really this position paper on nutrient timing, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, as you said, I think if you start off with where we're at right here, so I work at a university in St. Charles, Missouri called Lindenwood University. St. Charles is a kind of a northwest suburb of the St. Louis area. I direct a lab here that we call the Exercise and Performance Nutrition Laboratory. In that lab, it's primarily student run. We've got a couple of coordinators in there as well. So we use it as a primary teaching platform for our undergraduate and graduate students, but then we also conduct a number of different clinical research studies that focus on the interaction between exercise and nutrition, where many of those projects kind of zero in on health outcomes and performance and recovery outcomes as well. So that's kind of what I do on a day-to-day basis. Married, got two young girls, 7 and 9. So beyond the work here at the university, we're kind of chasing after them and all their activities. Prior to being here at Lindenwood, I've worked at a couple different faculty, or had a couple different faculty appointments. I worked at University of New Mexico in Albuquerque for a couple of years, and then I worked at University of Oklahoma as well.
Very cool.
Mm-hmm.
You are really interested in providing education, and I'm just wondering, why are you doing what you're doing?
I get asked that question, and I can't really explain it. I mean, I've been with all three of my degrees, they all have the word exercise in them. So there's just been something about exercise that has captured my interest from the very beginning. I know when I was my first research project, when I was in undergrad, that really kind of lit a switch in terms of, just for me, the pursuit of knowledge, being able to ask a question and then kind of design a study and work with students on answering those questions. It's just something that I've always just really valued. So I think that part of it, I'm a fairly, hungry learner. And I think that's the common thread that you see across, I think, many scientists and academics and people that truly like the processes. They just love to learn. So that is something that I think defines me. I'm continually reading different articles, for various reasons across kind of a fairly wide net of things.
I would absolutely agree with that.
Yeah. So, and I think it certainly started with the thirst. And then, as you mentioned, it's definitely pivoted into, that's my gift. I guess my gift is this hunger and this wanting to learn. So then it turns into where you want to try to do things to help give back, and you give back to, whether it's.
It is really authentically something I love about you, is this idea of giving back. And again, that's what really struck me. And with the influx of social media and the influx of what we are seeing access to in a way that we've never seen before, the people that are actually in the arena doing the work are overshadowed somewhat by the noise. And that creates a distance between what actually works and what is really going to serve the people. That brings me to, I'm assuming, why you guys wrote this position stand on nutrient timing. And, you examine all the evidence. From what I understand, you are bringing evidence-based information, examining all the evidence, the literature, and putting it in a position stand. Is that correct?
Yeah, pretty
Amazing.
much.
Let's jump in. So we're going to discuss what are nutrients. So we say nutrient timing. What are they?
Right. And I think, so like the most traditional definition of that would be things that provide, I think, number one, energy. So a lot of times within nutrition, right, we can classify different nutrients into like our macronutrients are those that give us energy, so carbs, fats, and proteins, and then we can have like micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, and some people will kind of lump water into that. So so essentially that's kind of what the position stand was locked in on, and like predominantly the macronutrients.
And the origins of nutrient timing really seem to start not that long ago, the 1970s, where they determined that there was a need for carbohydrates as it relates to glycogen, and glycogen is the storage form of carbohydrates used in endurance type activities. Did I get that correct?
Yeah, and it's funny because I think, like in today's day and age, I think there's so many people that would think like, nutrient timing was born with like, proteins and amino acids and taking, slugging down a protein shake surrounding a workout. Whereas the reality is it goes back to really with the 70s of people starting to realize that, hey, wait a minute, if we eat a high carbohydrate meal, or several meals, 2-3 days beforehand, that we've got more fuel packed into the muscles, and we can run further, we can run harder, cycle harder, etc.
And when we think about nutrient timing incorporates the use of methodology. It is really about methodical planning, eating whole foods, fortified foods, and dietary supplements. And ultimately, it's the timing of energy intake and the ratio of certain ingested macronutrients with the goal of enhancing recovery, tissue repair, augmenting muscle protein synthesis, which I have a specific interest in, improving mood, perhaps. And this is really following high volume or intensive exercise. Initially, when you break this down, what are the baseline recommendations? Who is it for? And how can an individual implement that?
Yeah, and I mean that's a really broad, I think, question, because I think, like number one, you when you get that type of a question, we always want people to think about, okay, well, what nutrient are we talking about? Because if we're talking about carbohydrates, you know, yeah, and if we just get into that, so like carbohydrate timing, we have, so certainly, basically what we're wanting to do is for different athletes that are, whether they're competitive or they're doing some type of a weekend event where they're really going to expend, a tremendous amount of fuel, where they are, going through a concerted effort of eating a series of meals for 2-3 days beforehand, while also kind of dialing back on their training volume. And we see that, the muscles get fairly loaded up, with glycogen, that stored form of carbohydrate. And then there's recommendations, 1 to 4 hours before. So think of team sport athletes and the traditional pregame meal. When should that be? What should that meal comprise of? And again, it needs to be pretty heavily leveraged towards carbohydrates.
Which is interesting because in today's society, there's a lot of different kind of nutrition strategies that people are talking about. There's a ketogenic style, there's a vegan vegetarian, there's a carnivore style, there's a paleo style. And really what you're talking about is fundamentally from a basic level carbohydrates, and carbohydrates are, things like potatoes and rice and pastas, and you guys probably use some kind of carbohydrate rich drink, right? Are there other carbohydrates that you guys leverage?
Sure. And I mean, I think a lot of that just kind of depends upon the specific study question. But yeah, different forms of carbohydrates and are very commonly used. But I think the one thing that I think is important to go back to is when you say like, who is timing for? And I think so. What you really start to get at there is because you're right. There's going to be a lot of signal coming out from various media sources about timing, and really, the research has become pretty clear that, for an everyday gym goer, somebody who's doing a hour-long workout most days of the week. I mean, somebody who could be extremely fit and extremely devoted to their body and health. Timing probably isn't that critical of an element for them. So it really, the more that we continue to study it, the potential benefit for timing really gets into the kind of the fringes of the extremes where we have people that are, they're doing multiple sessions of training per day that are either very intense or very long, or they have limited recovery windows. So you think of, sporting scenarios where maybe there's, so like a weekend tournament where they might play 2, 3, 4 games within a kind of 2 or 3 day period. Those types of recovery demands are really kind of present, I think, the best opportunity for things like timing.
And I want to stop you because for the listener, that's very liberating. There's a lot of right? There's a lot of confusion.
Yeah,
Should
absolutely.
I
Yeah,
should I
absolutely.
drink a
Right.
carbohydrate smoothie after I did
Right.
my cycling or after I went to the gym and I lifted? That becomes very liberating in this idea that if we are to optimize health, does it need to be as mechanical, as just very kind of fine tuned? And the answer is probably as long as our macronutrient ratios are optimized for our individual body. And the idea that perhaps we are not training in some exponential way. I only train for an hour a day. That it probably is not going to be very important for me, nutrient timing, as it relates to carbohydrate ingestion.
Right. Agreed.
And, I did some of the calculations. I was looking at one of the key recommendations on this position paper was endogenous glycogen stores, which again, we spoke about what glycogen is. It's the storage form of carbohydrates, are maximized by following a high carbohydrate diet. And this is actually really high. 8 to 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram per day. And I just want to put that into perspective for people. And this was obviously, these stores were depleted most by high volume exercise, which I would love for you to mention exactly what that is, or at least a framework. And I'm about 52 kilograms, so it's about 115 pounds. And at the low end of the carbohydrate recommendation for someone who is incredibly active, that puts me at 52 times 8, which is 416 grams of carbohydrates. And at the
Right.
high end, it's over 600.
I know. Yeah. I mean, the numbers are extremely high. Now, I think, one of the things that I like about the science is the sense that position stand was written in 2018. So I think even since that time, even the 4-year period now, we would probably work hard to make it really pretty clear that 8 to 12 number is really even better, is more so focused in on a competitive endurance athlete. Somebody who's a runner or a cyclist, a tour cyclist, where they're out for, 2 hours, minimum 3 hours, 4 hours, most days of the week, doing what they do. So, and then, but even then, the reality is that people that are training at high intensities and, moderately high volumes, 60 to 120 minutes most days of the week, we're still looking at 5 grams per kg on the very low end, up to probably about 8 grams per kg. I think, so it's still, so the numbers come down, and it's all relative to your volume. But the reality is that I think one of the things that we always try to emphasize to people is that, you have these people that will go to the gym every day. They're very serious about their workouts. They'll go in, they'll go extremely hard for an hour and 15 minutes, and they'll read these papers and they think, well, I work out 6 days a week. Like I need to be at 8-9 grams per kg per day. And you're just like, well, maybe, but probably not really, because, again, like the amount of training volume that a non-competitive athlete goes through in comparison to an organized competitive athlete is typically quite a bit smaller. So that's the part of it that these discussions are helpful, hopefully, for people, is you start to, you have to just kind of get a really good, honest assessment on who you are and where you fit. It doesn't make you good or bad or better or worse. It just, we want to try to kind of put you into that right spot. Because I'll tell you that 25 years ago, we didn't even have that much detail within the carbohydrate recommendation. It was just more of a blanket 7 to 10 grams per kg for nearly anyone that considered themselves an athlete. And we've certainly developed.
Yeah. What would be a baseline recommendation for someone who is going to the gym and they're, putting in moderate amount of activity, but we can first start by saying endurance, and they're putting in an hour of day of endurance activity. And I think it's really important to say these are healthy individuals. I'm obviously just making up this group because I am curious in terms of, are these recommendations translatable to individuals who are obese or who have some kind of low-grade inflammation? From a protein perspective, there's a little bit of what, I've seen some literature to highlight that they have a little bit of anabolic resistance, quite frankly. And I know we're talking about carbohydrates, but I am just curious about, in terms of the health of the skeletal muscle, it seems as if we have to decide, or an individual needs to decide, are they metabolically healthy or not? So if an individual is metabolically healthy, can they go through with some of these carbohydrate recommendations? And I would define metabolically healthy by having a triglyceride level easily under 100, fasting, blood sugar, insulin, that is all within normal ranges, versus, say, a metabolically unhealthy individual. I would not recommend loading up on any kind of carbohydrates, and I'm sure that you would say the same. But back to my question, what would you recommend a traditional gym goer?
Yeah, and I think, that's such an important question, because the reality is that I think the majority of the listeners are probably going to kind of fall within that realm. And I think 3 to 5 grams per kg per day functions as a really pretty reasonable range. I think it's another thing it's important for people to hear is that when you hear these ranges, we're not trying to throw a dart and hit the bullseye every single time with the recommendations. The recommendations are more about that we're very confident that when we throw that dart, we're going to hit the dartboard, that we're going to put that dart reasonably in the same area. And I think mentally that's an important perspective, because people have to realize that, if you train more on one day, well, then that carbohydrate number is going to be higher. And also too, if you decide to take a day off, or you're traveling and you're not able to work out, maybe you just go on some walks so your intensity and durations are lower, then you need to bring those carbohydrate numbers down, but you still may kind of fall within that range. The latter part of what you were highlighting, so now if we pivot into a population of people that are going to be probably more sedentary than active, if they're metabolically not as healthy as they could be, their fitness status and capacity is probably very much on the low end of things. That's where we would almost kind of look at where, there's from a carbohydrate intake, they can probably do pretty well with having a fairly limited amount of carbohydrate throughout the day. And I think as long as they're feeling kind of fueled through their workouts, because it needs to be highlighted. When we're exercising, carbohydrates are the fuel. It doesn't matter if you're 100 pounds overweight or you are a world-class CrossFitter or ultramarathon athlete. If you are exercising, carbohydrates are being burned preferentially by your muscle tissue. So that's why we talk about carbohydrates relative to activity and exercise. So you do have to kind of have this spectrum, right, of people that that will likely be achieving different levels of exercise. Because the things that I love about exercise for that metabolically challenged person, right, is the fact that we know that as we exercise, and man, if I start talking about muscle, you're
Yeah,
gonna
all
start getting
fired
all
up.
kinds of
No, I'm
excited,
already
right?
fired up. I wake up
You
like
know,
this.
yeah, but I think that but as people begin to adopt a regular exercise program and the fitness status of their muscle tissue, the quality of their muscle tissue increases, as we know, right? Their ability to metabolize fats through our diet and in our body, and glucose levels in our blood, the muscle tissue just a great reservoir, not reservoir, a great sponge, a great consumer of those potential sources of energy, and that's a very healthy thing for, I mean, especially for people that are maybe looking to develop a consistent exercise habit. Where there's a tremendous amount of positive that comes from a metabolic health perspective of just being a regular exerciser. That's an extremely important point that doesn't really relate much, I think, to nutrient timing, but it's something that is extremely important just in terms of public health.
Protein is an essential part of eating well for health and thriving in life, no matter your age, gender, or goals. Getting in adequate amounts of protein every day is an area that a lot of people struggle, and can struggle even more during the busy, on the go months of summer. However, no matter how busy we are, we can still get adequate amounts of protein in with a simple amount of planning and supplementation when needed. When it comes to protein and protein powders, they are not all the same. The type of protein and the quality of the protein makes a big difference in how it fuels your body. And for me, I've been using First Form's Formula One natural protein powder since 2018. It's a high quality, pure whey protein isolate sweetened with stevia, has optimal amounts of branched chain amino acids, and is a convenient option to help get in adequate amounts of protein. Great to use as part of that first meal of the day or around a workout, or really anytime you need to increase your protein. You can check out Formula One Natural and other supplements at First, spelled 1stphorm.com/Dr. Lyon.
Is very potent for the metabolism, potent for macronutrient utilization. Now, I calculated when you mentioned 3 to 5 grams per kilogram, depending on how intensive someone is training, I calculated a minimum intake for me would be 156 grams. That's assuming I'm doing an hour of exercise.
I think, again, even if that would go down to, even like a little bit more moderate duration of 35 to 40 minutes, if it's a really good, high quality, moderate to sometimes a little bit of kind of mixed in with some vigorous intensity. I think that's a reasonable number for in terms of a start, and then as the intensity as well as the duration increases, then that's why now we can justify a little bit of a higher recommendation on that.
And in terms of
intake.
Timing, for example, I go and I'm going to go do sprint intervals as much as I can. Now we're talking about a little more anaerobic activity, but sprint intervals for as hard as I can, as long as I can, first thing in the morning. Does it matter what kind of nutrients in terms of nutrient timing? Does it matter when I have my first meal? Does it matter if that is carbohydrates or dietary protein?
Right. So great question. There's a tremendous amount of interest in like, whether we're talking about fasted cardio or fasted exercise, or should you eat or should you not eat? And my answer for that would be, I think particularly if we're talking about something where, so the exercise you mentioned takes great, like psychological, like emotional intent. Like you don't decide to do cycling intervals or running intervals and just half-ass it. You know what I mean? Like
And nobody listening,
you
no
gotta
listener
mentally,
is going to feel that they're not going to do that either. They're going to go all in.
you, right. So but I think because certainly, right, there's certain types of workouts where yeah, you could alternatively just get on a treadmill at 5:30 in the morning and just kind of zombie your way through a 30-minute walk, and it is what it is. So I think when we're talking about an exercise session that takes some intent and some mental focus and desire, I think it does certainly make sense to have some carbohydrate, kind of circulating around in the blood, because after an overnight sleep, 6, 7, 8 hours. I mean, there's kind of a number of studies that show that through sleep, I mean the amount of liver glycogen that we have gets wiped out pretty good, and when that's gone, then our carbohydrate stores get pushed over a little bit more towards like our muscle glycogen stores, and so definitely that it makes sense to have some type of a small carbohydrate meal or snack. The thing is, again, we have to be practical. So if it's an early morning session, and people think to themselves, God, I don't like getting up early to begin with, and now he's telling me I got to get up 30, 45 minutes, even earlier to get something to eat. And that's where people just kind of have to kind of figure out their, like what's going to be their priority. You know what I mean? Like if you've got to get up early because of your other time demands and family demands, and that threatens your ability or compromises your ability to get some carbohydrates in your system, then that may challenge your ability to really get after it and push it a little bit in the morning. So I think that another consideration is also we always want to make sure that people don't go a little bit overboard with what they're eating, and now they kind of overwhelm their stomach and their gut, and they get cramps, they might vomit, you know what I mean? Like they get all upset, and then that ruins their experience as well too. So there's a lot of practical aspects. I think certainly, carbohydrate solutions can be a nice alternative, or something to consider, or if you want to try to get, because then there's people out there that are really pretty sensitive to symptoms of hypoglycemia. Where they get really nauseated, they feel really, really weak, and they really need some carbs. So those types of people would certainly probably prioritize a little bit more of, having some type of a carbohydrate snack or drink ready to go when they're, if we're leaving the gym. If we get away from that early morning time period, then it's just a matter of just kind of scheduling some things. It's like, hey, if you're going to hit the gym at 10 o'clock, have something at, usually 2-3 hours before, functions at a really pretty good time. It allows for some digestion to occur, and you kind of go from there. So
basically what I'm hearing you say is don't really stress about it. There's some benefit. There is some benefit in terms of performance, but it really is individual. And, thinking about the recommendations, whether it's 3 to 5 grams per kilogram or higher if you are a very competitive athlete, 8 to 12 grams per kilogram a day. Those are recommendations that are supported in the literature. You also mentioned about, actually you didn't mention about this. You did mention about a carbohydrate solution. And what I have here is for greater than 70% of VO2 max, exercise for fuel supply and fluid regulation, carbohydrates could be consumed between 30 and 60 grams of carbohydrate an hour. And actually, Don Layman also talks about that quite a bit in a 6 to 8% carbohydrate electrolyte solution. I'm curious as to what you are utilizing for electrolytes. I know we're talking about macronutrient timing. Do you speak on electrolyte solution timing as well as it relates to performance, if at all?
Yeah, and so the literature base relative to a timing scenario it has been largely unexplored in terms of timing delivery of electrolytes in different amounts or even ratios. That's a whole aspect of science that, quite honestly, researchers haven't really explored. So there's a potential, kind of unturned stone in that respect. And, I think when we talk about a glucose electrolyte solution, I mean that's just a fancy terminology for, some type of like a commercial sports beverage, whether it's a Gatorade or a Powerade or any of the other brands that have kind of entered into the marketplace.
Well, we certainly know
The
hydration
last
is
several
incredibly
years.
important, really, even outside the scope of exercise. In terms, yeah,
I, I mean, and I sorry to interrupt you, but I think in that perspective, that is probably, particularly this time of the year. I mean, from a recovery angle, you'll always hear a lot of conversation, right, about the role of carbohydrates and protein. But the one thing that a lot of people really overlook is actually like replenishing lost fluid. It is a critical driver for I mean temperature regulation, but just really getting the body into a scenario where it can kind of get on with life and
absolutely.
get after
I
it
would
again the next
love
day.
to move into resistance exercise and your perspective on carbohydrate ingestion throughout resistance exercise. And we can say that's, 3 to 6 sets of 8 to 12 repetition, multiple exercises targeting all major muscle groups. Tell me what your thoughts are in terms of baseline recommendations so that the listener can implement that, if in fact there's any relevance to that.
Yeah, and I think right, and so carbohydrates and resistance training performance have it's there's definitely not as much of a developed literature base for that mode of exercise. The in the late 60s and the 70s, there was just a tremendous amount of work done with endurance models, and there's a number of reasons why that is. But in terms of resistance exercise, there's really not a firm recommendation either for or against it. I think there's many studies that show that yeah, it may help with exercise performance or feelings of intent, and then there's a number of studies that show that taking carbohydrates may not necessarily impact maximal strength or repetitions completed. So there's that's a bit of a wash, and I think that can be confusing. I think for the consumer at times. So I think for me, a lot of that goes back to preference. Because I know just as many people that they simply cannot imagine the thought of going into like a weight training session and not have some source of carbohydrates either in their system before they start or kind of throughout. And it does make sense when we're lifting weights, our muscles are burning carbohydrates. So certainly if you're relatively carbohydrate restricted throughout the day, and if you're energy restricted throughout the day, those two terms right there, those you add them up, and that means that there's just not a whole lot of carbohydrate around. And then you go into a gym session and you're trying to lift weights, heavier weights, more times, more sets, more muscles, like your body's burning up carbohydrates that are already limited by the fact that you've cut calories and you've cut carbs. So that's where I see a lot of people will leverage their carbohydrate intake surrounding their workout because they're almost kind of saving their carbs for their workout.
And frankly, I actually think that's a great strategy, even if we're talking about that it may perhaps not make huge improvements in performance, simply based on utilization, simply based on the fact that it's possible that it can improve efficiency of use. What about, so we're talking about throughout resistance exercise. In terms of post-exercise carbohydrate consumption, do you feel that if we are in the gym and we are using muscle glycogen, we are using glucose, post-exercise, is there benefit to carbohydrate repletion in that regard?
Right. And I think how I answer that scenario, I think the most important thing for somebody to highlight when you're put into that that question or that answer or the whole context is, what is the goal? Like, what outcome are we striving for surrounding that question? Because I think a lot of times we have two camps with that answer, and one of them is, well, my goal is to maximize muscle hypertrophy. I want to pack on as much muscle as possible. I want to get as big and lean as possible. And in that situation, carbohydrates are not really that anabolic from a skeletal muscle perspective. So they're not. There's certain researchers that have examined those questions really pretty good, and I think it's become pretty well established that carbohydrates certainly provide a supportive role with overall adaptations, but they're not a primary driver in muscle hypertrophy. So in that instance, that's where optimal dietary protein intake is going to become important. Essential amino acid intake. Now, if the other side of that coin, the other camp would like performance and recovery. So like if they're doing a gym session in the morning and then they're going to come back in the evening and run some intervals, or they're going to do like a fasted walk in the morning, but then come back in the gym in the afternoon and really want to get after it and crush back and buys in another body part. Well, consuming some carbohydrate leading up to those workouts where your intensity is going to be up, it just makes sense, and that's where, again, even if the literature base doesn't necessarily clearly point towards an enhancement in performance, I think nearly anyone would say, you know what, I'm just going to feel better. Like if I have carbs in my system, like I'm just going to grab bigger weights. I'm going to want to try to do it more times. And I don't really think anybody within exercise physiology would question the
Dr. Chad, are you saying we are using
So,
common sense?
you know what? I know that's hard for some people to do
Incredible.
at times, right? But yeah, I think it does. That's where, we can simplify it so much by if people just accept the fact that if you're exercising at an intensity that you consider to be medium intensity to hard, your body is burning carbohydrates during whatever activity it is. I don't care what it is. So if that's what you're engaging in, then it makes sense for you to have.
And I want to
enough
stop you because that
carbohydrates
is
to
very
fuel those
important. It doesn't
activities.
matter if you are running, doesn't matter if you are lifting. You're just saying if you are putting moderate intensity exercise in your life, you are utilizing glucose, you're utilizing the substrate, and there would be no reason why.
There's no question about it. Like, absolutely yes. So, and I think that's one of, kind of goes back to the first 10 minutes that we were, just that there's a lot of signal that's coming out from different sources and different articles that are written with a certain purpose or a certain outcome in mind, and they don't really fully vet the background kind of surrounding it. And I think it's just important for people to understand that, if you're going to exercise and try to work hard, your muscles are going to burn carbohydrates. That's just what happens.
And I have two questions here. Number one, how does an individual on a ketogenic diet fare in this burning glucose in skeletal muscle? And yeah, well, let's start with that question.
Well, and that is such a fair question because, ketogenic diets have become extremely unpopular. They are, because again, I think many times some of these sources of information, they pitch or leverage a keto diet as, magical or more powerful at weight loss or, kind of being, the missing secret in terms of what people may be looking for. So it sounds extremely attractive. So the level of popularity, it does, I think, make sense a little bit. There's, in terms of truly understanding like the role of a ketogenic diet in terms of a wide spectrum of activities, science has a bit of catching up to do. I think in general, and and if you just kind of bear with me, like what all, if we kind of take different activities across the intensity spectrum, so like what I would teach my students, I would say, like an Olympic weightlifter, a shot putter, a discus thrower could probably fare pretty well on like a ketogenic diet because they're doing one unbelievably explosive, powerful, forceful movement that's over in 5 seconds. So we're, even though we're burning carbohydrates, then it only lasts for 5 seconds. And then as you transition, then we have things like weightlifting and soccer, and then we, team sports, basketball, lacrosse, then we move into, the more of, prolonged endurance activities, whether it's a 10K, 5K, 10K, half marathon, marathon, and so on. The longer that the duration goes, because again, like as we work harder, irrespective of what we're doing, we're going to burn carbohydrates. Ketogenic diet is going to, if you're following the typical prescriptions, right, they're consuming, 30 to 50 grams of carbs per day, ballpark, So that's not a lot. I mean, you'll burn that amount of carbohydrates up in a 45-minute gym session. So it's over pretty quick. So if you're doing those activities, I think the key thing with the role of the impact of a ketogenic diet, it boils down to like, if you want to be able to perform at your optimal ability, which probably means that you need to lift more, run faster, pedal harder, swim harder, whatever it might be, you need, a ketogenic diet is not going to deliver enough carbohydrates to get that done. And we do consistently see that in the literature. There is a play. I mean, I think for me personally, I think the world of like ultra endurance athletes, these people that are, ultra endurance is commonly defined as just any event
And
that's
that could
longer than a
be
marathon.
100 miles.
It
Could be.
It could be. It could be a 30-mile run. It could be a 100-mile run. It could be a 200-mile run. Again, they haven't really developed that definition a little bit more. Of course, we could do other modes of activity, but we're talking about things that are, at least 3 hours long, 4 hours long, and many of them are much, 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 much longer. In those scenarios, our intensity has to come down, right? You can't just keep running at an extremely high pace for anywhere near that amount of time. So when we exercise at a little bit lower intensity, our body's able to burn more fat for fuel, and we can maintain that intensity. And that's really where I feel like a higher fat diet or a ketogenic diet is probably going to find its home for many different groups of athletes. And I think but just the reality is that for people that have some level of intensity to their workouts and they want that intensity to be as high as possible, they need to figure out a way how to get carbohydrates into their body surrounding their workouts. And Louise Burke from Australia has probably done the best work in that. She's just a fantastic scientist, world-class individual. She did a kind of a series of studies on basically the best like race walkers in the world, and just some fascinating designs where they had high carbohydrate diets and ketogenic diets, and they really consistently showed that when a ketogenic diet was employed, that the athlete's ability to achieve peak intensities and perform was really compromised, and they did better when there was more carbohydrate in the diet.
That is very interesting, because also when you think about nutrient timing, it seems as if in general fat has been overlooked.
Yeah, it has, and I think really kind of probably for a couple of reasons. And I think number one, the fact that we see such dynamic changes in carbohydrate amount across a 2-3 hour window of exercise, much less across the day. So we see that the amount of stored carbohydrate is pretty drastically changing. And then we also know from a number of studies that carbohydrate is just a a very much preferred fuel source. So there's just been a lot of focus towards carbohydrates because, quite frankly, when there's more carbohydrate available to the muscle, people run faster and they run longer and they cycle harder. So fats is, there's definitely been research that has explored, short-term high-fat diets and long-term high-fat diets and high-fat ketogenic diets. And I think consistently what we see with higher fats, and not necessarily timed, and I'll talk about why we don't want to worry about timing fats, but the higher fat diets in general, what we run into there is that it's really pretty fascinating. When we give more fat to our muscle adapts and it gets better at burning fat for fuel. Muscle is so cool in the sense that it does that. But the thing is that this is why I love Louise Burke's perspective. Again, so she was kind of the head sport nutritionist, for Australia for years, and she would simply say, does it make my athletes win?
I like her.
Like, I'm worried about winning gold medals. I don't care about how much. Yeah. It's like I don't care about how much. I mean, I care about how much fat that they burn, but are they winning? Are they setting PRs? Are they what she would say, like, what color is the medal on their neck? So, and in that respect, what we see is that with higher fat diets, short-term or long-term, ketogenic or not, that the muscle is able to retool itself and burn more fat, but they're not able to consistently perform as well as if they had more carbohydrates in the diet. So if you truly are competitive in the sense that you want to be able to run a 5K as fast as you can, or whatever it is, that again, carbohydrates really become kind of a pretty central ingredient in that outcome. From a fat timing perspective, the biggest thing would be the fact that, fat digests really pretty slow. And, so you always want to, we actually, as we get into pregame meals and things along those lines, those meals are commonly recommended where we want to have relatively low amounts of fiber and relatively low amounts of fat, just because digestion rates slow down. If you eat a lot of fat or a lot of fiber, an hour before, 2 hours before, that can still be hanging around in the stomach, and that can make it pretty tough for people to get out and work pretty hard.
I'd like to thank another partner of the show, and that is Insight Tracker. And you guys know that I really believe in blood work, and I think you can't track, you can't adjust, and you don't know the data that you don't uncover. And this is why blood work is very important. Insight Tracker, you guys can take your health in your own hands if you're looking for ways to optimize your hormones or get a sense of how your iron is looking. Insight Tracker is easy, affordable, and you can do it yourself. Insight Tracker provides you with personalized plans to improve your metabolism, reduce stress, and improve sleep, optimize your health for the long haul. But most important, it provides you with data, and I think data is what can drive your choices. For a limited time, you'll get 20% off the entire Insight Tracker store. I think Insight Tracker is a great direct-to-consumer way to self-educate and really explore what works for you, what doesn't. Just go to insighttracker.com/Dr. Lyon. Again, 20% off. I think that this is a great service.
That makes a lot of sense. I wouldn't be having you on a podcast and not talking about protein. I would love to discuss protein timing as it relates to both endurance and resistance exercise. And then at some point, I know we have limited time today, but obviously we're going to be doing this again, and then we're going to be doing this in person. But I also would love to get into the next frontier of what we're going to be seeing over, I'm imagining, the next decade, which is plant protein and the variations of plant protein and how that actually impact exercise. So let's start with nutrient timing of protein, please.
Yep.
Oh, good. Yeah.
So
I'm just going to listen, take some notes, learn.
And you just jump in. and and stop me, interrupt me, stop me, kind of wherever you want me to. But I think when we talk about, we deal with protein timing. I mean, just, that is probably the macronutrient that just blew the top off of the popularity of nutrient timing. The whole notion that consuming amino acids immediately after a workout or before a workout would, lead to better gains, just really, like I said, led to just exponential popularity in the topic. And I think as we've started to, the overall, I mean, the literature has really become pretty clear. And I think, honestly, probably a little bit disappointing for people that really want timing to be something. But, we see consistently that if an individual is getting enough protein in their diet throughout the day, that timing for a large majority of individuals probably is going to exert little to no influence.
And I also want to mention, I actually was having a long conversation with Don about why that's what some of the literature shows. And do you want to know what he says? Don says he believes that timing matters. And the reason we are not seeing big changes is because the majority of the studies are utilizing protein timing in that first meal of the day. So typically it's after an overnight fast. So in the literature, they're overlooking the fact that it's the first meal of the day that everyone is studying. And if you were to backload the protein and actually change, so if you were to have a higher protein dinner, he's actually going to come out with a paper on this, and I'm probably not even supposed to be talking about this. So I'm sorry, Don, but this is Chad, and this is very important. So he does believe that protein matters, and he is under the impression that we're just not looking at it in the appropriate way, and that it's all the data is based on that first meal. And if protein timing didn't matter, then it wouldn't matter where individuals place those meals. So anyway.
Right. And I mean, when I hear you say that, that artifact is indeed a reality, in the sense that, when we go about designing studies, right, it's, we're wanting to control. So many of the studies, use that overnight fast as an option to kind of level things off metabolically, and you get people in pretty consistently in the morning, and then you invoke your intervention. So that part of things I think is really neat. We're starting to see some more work with pre-sleep protein intake from a timing perspective, and the potential influence on that. I mean, timing's not done. I mean, there are people and stories that'll be written, but it's we're kind of in the kind of a natural evolution of, timing's amazing. No, timing is garbage. No, wait, timing might work. And then we have other people, just exactly like, what Don has mentioned, is that no, wait a minute. Like there could be some things here. Let's explore this possible scenario. So it'll be really neat to see.
But what you are saying is, in the literature right now, the large body of evidence would suggest that total protein intake is most important. I'm curious, is in terms of perspective, from a sporting perspective, I would say from a health perspective, aging individuals, also obese individuals seem to have a bit of anabolic resistance, but that's not related to, quote, timing. Now we're talking about dosing. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I think what a lot of times, and we may use the terminology like protein patterns, what's their pattern of consuming protein throughout the day? Because that really kind of reflects, if they're, are they eating 2 meals versus, 4 meals or 5 meals? And then obviously if they are achieving anywhere near kind of a recommended total protein intake, then that's by function is going to affect their dose, what dose they're consuming. So that's where, I mean, we could literally we could do multiple.
We won't. I want to hear your current recommendations. I want to hear the International Society for Sports Nutrition's recommendations on protein, because I know the listener wants to know that and your perspective.
Right. So I think, I was, fortunate to be a part of that writing group. So, Ralph Yeager is the first author on the ISSN position stand on protein. our recommendation for active individuals and such is kind of 1.4 to 2 grams per kg per day. The RDA sits at 0.8. I think for me, if people really just want to know, well, what do you think? And my go-to recommendation for
Great.
nearly everyone is 2 times
There's
the
a
RDA,
lot of data
which is
to support
1.6.
that. There's a lot of
I
data to
just
support that.
think yeah, there's a wonderful position stand with authors from the American College of Sports Nutrition, or I'm sorry, American College of Sports Medicine, Society of Nutrition and Dietetics, Dietitians of Canada. They kind of combined, and I think their guideline is somewhere around that 1.6 to 1.8 as well. So you see a lot of pretty large groups hovering around that 1.6, 1.8 range. And again, I don't really think you'll see many people that'll kind of back away from that. So I think in general, for the majority of people, is what I would say is that if you're you want to strive each day to hit your protein target, spread it out across the day, and that's your number one goal. And then as your level of again, the volume and the intensity and the level of restriction or recovery demands, as we look at those factors, then we can kind of provide a little bit of suggestion that timing in some scenarios might create a little bit better of an opportunity for recovery and adaptations and things along those lines.
And it's probably for not the healthy population. It's probably more leveraged towards those with anabolic resistance, meaning there is a decrease in protein efficiency. For example, as a geriatrician and right down the street from you at WashU, post-training, it lowers their threshold need for protein, having them do resistance exercise. And there's a great paper in the Journal of Endocrinology, I'll link it here, that post-exercise, they actually get a more robust response from the muscle with a lower protein intake, which of course, for an aging individual, a more mature individual, sometimes overall calorie intake is much lower than we'd like it to be. So there may be some benefit. And also, there was an interesting paper from, I think it's Nick Bird, and he wrote a paper on the anabolic resistance that obesity may also create anabolic resistance in skeletal muscle. And that may be another group where perhaps the training, exercise training and protein timing may be of some benefit.
100%. And I think that's an area, that the scientific literature, certainly has some catching up to do. Because I think, overwhelmingly the literature that has been examined has been, kind of zeroed in a little bit more
I
on
agree.
active individuals, competitive athletes, and the potential role. And that's largely probably been driven by, sports nutrition industry. But you bring up such a great point in the sense that, absolutely, aging individuals, low fitness individuals, the health of their skeletal tissue is nowhere near where it needs to be and where it could be. And you're exactly right in the sense that you start doing some really nice, efficacious doses of resistance training, that muscle becomes unbelievably sensitized to glucose and amino acids and all of these types of nutrients. And it's just one of the many wonderful things that we see from exercise, particularly resistance exercise, and its impact on skeletal muscle.
Yeah, and you create flux of the nutrients, which ultimately is very important for our muscular health. I know that we're short on time today, but don't worry, everybody. We'll bring Dr. Chad back. We'll do it in person. And the concept of protein obviously is not going anywhere. And within the last 10 years, listen, I have been doing this for 20 years. And 20 years ago, nobody was talking about plant protein. There really wasn't this huge dichotomy. It seems to have been in the last handful of years, there has absolutely been an explosion and interest into how we can incorporate plant proteins. And I suppose the question is, what impact does that have? Do you want to kick it off, or you want me to talk about, you know?
No, you're exactly right. Because I remember, going through undergraduate and kind of first, kind of experimenting with different proteins and looking at different dietary supplements, and I mean, there's nothing being discussed about various sources of plants. Prior to, I think, 2004, maybe that's not right, but basically, nearly all of the original literature what was done with soy, and there's, but I think in general, with how the different metrics that are out there to assess quality, there's.
And you're talking about metrics, you're talking about PDCAS, which is, and DIAS, yep. Mm-hmm.
Correct. Yeah, protein utilization ratios, and yeah. So there's, and I think for the listener that may not be familiar with that, there are just some different rating scales that scientists have developed that allow researchers and clinicians and various people to compare different sources of protein in kind of a head-to-head fashion, to highlight which sources might be considered to be a higher quality or lower quality. And then when we do that, the animal proteins tend to fare really pretty well. So that, I think, kind of led the way in terms of, well, which sources should we consume? And then I think that then we also started getting this proliferation of literature, right, from Bob Wolf's group, and from those. He's in Little Rock now, and they have absolutely transformed what we know about protein, exercise, and amino acids, and they really kind of made it clear that the concentration of essential amino acids in the blood is a primary driver, is a primary signal to the skeletal tissue on kind of promote increases in muscle protein synthesis, greater improvements overall in muscle protein turnover. So when you take that, so now we've said, okay, well, essential amino acids are key. All right. Quick definition. I mean, essential amino acids are those that we've got to get them from the diet. Our body can't make them. It's essential that we get them in our diet. Animal sources of protein have the highest amounts of those amino acids. So if you just listen to the last minute, like you can quickly see, right, the logic as to why animal proteins have really become the most popular. So now you enter in, plant proteins they were never really explored. I think because the consumer was just wanting whey protein, which is a milk protein, and they were just wanting different animal sources. And then I think, again, there was a few studies done in soy, nothing that really ever piqued anybody's interest, because there was just as many studies that showed that there wasn't any difference, as that there was. And then I think Jordan Joy published a paper where they compared a rice protein isolate to a whey protein, and they dosed it really pretty high at 48 grams over 8 weeks, and they showed that similar changes in strength and body composition were observed. And that was really, I remember reading that paper for the first time and just thinking, something's wrong, something's off here, like this just can't be. Like everybody knows that whey protein is the best. And then a few years passed, and there was another paper that popped up with some pea protein, and it kind of showed kind of some similar things. My research group, we had an opportunity to do a follow-up study to that rice versus whey study, and where we actually dosed it 24 grams across 8 weeks. One group consumed a rice protein, another group consumed a whey protein. Resistance trained males, they trained 4 days per week. We measured strength and body composition, and again, we showed that both groups got.
And were they untrained or trained individuals?
They were modestly trained. They were certainly not, the most, highly resistance trained athletes that you would find, but they certainly were not sedentary. They certainly were not.
And they were, what was their age? They were younger?
Yeah, the delimitations on, I mean, I think, I don't know what our average age was off the top of my head, but I know we kind of delimited it to, you know, like probably like 18 to 40 years of age, or like 18 to 50 years of age. So we definitely stayed away from, you know, kind of a older, you know, elderly type of a population. But basically, you know, we found that, you know, the adaptations were similar between the two groups. So that was the second study done with rice. You know, there's just been a number of studies done by different research groups that have used, you know, the stable isotope model to assess muscle protein synthesis rates, which is just kind of it's a pretty invasive technique to measure, you know, how much muscle protein is being built. And they've, and again, they've, I think the working dialogue would now suggest that, you know, irrespective of the source of protein, if you're able to deliver enough essentials, that you're going to be able to achieve some pretty positive changes in muscle protein synthesis rate. So that's a good thing. You know, again, you mentioned this earlier, you know, kind of the comment from, you know, like liberating, you know, like, I mean, that has the potential to be liberating for some people that really want to try to limit their animal protein intake or increase their plant protein intake, whether, you know, kind of for, you know, I mean, a number of different reasons, you know, but I think, so that's really kind of, you know, where we're at, where I think a large bit of people would certainly acknowledge that if people are able to get enough protein and able to get enough essential amino acids within each protein dose consistently across the day, that plant proteins can probably support positive exercise training adaptations more so than what we ever really thought.
And I think at this point we can all agree on that. What's interesting is that, yes, when you account for because it's really the amino acids, we're not eating for protein, we're really eating for those 20 amino acids, 9 of which are essential. Of those 9, we really need the branched chains, especially leucine. And when you increase the leucine threshold enough, you will be able to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. If an individual is younger, they can have a lower dose, hence, which is probably why you saw the same impact in a 24-gram dose of rice protein, as you would as a whey protein. Were their amino acid profiles the same?
No, they weren't. I mean, you know, I mean, whey protein certainly has more of the essentials and more, you know, more leucine, more total amino acids. But what we did on that, but we had a really good idea what the amino acid composition was going to be in that rice protein. So that 24-gram dose, we felt, you know, was going to be just
like
enough to
1.8
meet
grams of
kind
leucine,
of
perhaps.
like the minimum theoretical thresholds.
Yep.
Yeah. I think that's
sense.
literally like right about what was being delivered. So I think so that part of it, you know, just kind of works into, you know, kind of the overall dialogue. So when, you know, the review paper that we wrote that you mentioned, and that was really just kind of, you know, the overall summary of where things were, you know, within the literature. There's certainly absolutely more work that needs to be done, you know, because I think that, you know, as we start to spin that, you know, one key thing with animals versus plants is, you know, you have to recognize, right, that plant proteins have, you know, like a much lower rates of digestibility. They also have more kind of carbohydrates bound to them that kind of compromises the body's ability to get amino acids into the blood. And as you mentioned just a few minutes ago, that's the golden ticket, is getting amino acid levels up.
Which is why the DIAS score for the rice protein, all the isolates are higher. But then the next concern, I think, where the literature is going to go, and you and I were talking about this offline, is that when you are now isolating things that are not found in nature, two things happen. One, you diminish the food matrix. Whey protein is a food source that we find. It has immunoglobulins. Rice pea blends, while there's definitely positive ways in which one can use it. I mean, it's amazing that now we have another food source. We are talking about a highly processed food, and also we're eliminating the food matrix. The other things that come alongside of whole foods, and I am not, so there's the amino acid amount. And then there are other things above and beyond amino acid amounts that I'm not sure we totally have a grasp on. What are your thoughts on that?
And we don't. I mean, I think the whole notion of the food, like a protein matrix or a food matrix. I mean, I think of Dan Moore at University of Toronto, who's one of Stu Phillips's students, and like he's done a really nice job of really kind of focusing in on that, and I that will absolutely be a key area of research, because I think we're going to start to see that I think the matrix side of things is really where we're going to start to identify the protein food sources roles in terms of supporting health, just other kind of health related outcomes. I certainly might be wrong about that, but that's just kind of what my gut's telling me.
I would agree with you. I think you're absolutely right. And again, we'll end this here because I know you have to run to your next meeting. And in essence, it's not about being divided, right? It's not about animal versus plant. It's about what do we need to do to have a healthy planet. And really, to have a healthy planet, we have to have these transparent conversations. And I think that they're incredibly valuable. And in terms of evolving science, it is very important. So, Dr. Chad, my friend, thank you so much for being on. I know that you're not super active on Instagram, but you are active on Twitter. I will link your Twitter. I will also link your lab's webpage with your numerous publications. Is there anything else that you would like to share?
Not really, except that just thank you. I mean, like I said, it's always.
I mean, we need at least another hour.
An hour and 15 minutes passes.
We didn't even get to talk about caffeine, which I wanted to talk about.
We
didn't get to talk about bicarb. We didn't get to talk about creatine. Yeah.
We scratched the surface on plant proteins. I mean, but thank you. It's always great to see you. It's always fun to talk with you. I certainly look forward to being on again. And certainly if anybody has any questions or anything else, just go ahead and kind of put all my information out there, and I'll answer them as I get to them.
I will. And you are very generous with your time. Thank you so much. And I will see you in November.
Look forward to it.